43 years. That's how long one man ran the most feared criminal organization in the Western world without a single phone call, without a single email, without ever once saying his plans out loud where a microphone could catch him. He didn't vanish into the mountains. He didn't hide in some far-off country under a new name. For most of those 4 decades, Bernardo Provenzano was living less than an hour from the town he was born in, sleeping in farmhouses investigators had already searched, eating dinner within earshot of the police looking for him. How does a man become invisible while never actually leaving? The answer wasn't a disguise. It was a folded scrap of paper, typed on an old manual typewriter, wrapped in cellophane tape, and passed hand to hand through a chain of couriers so long that no single person in it knew where the message began or where it would end. The Sicilian Mafia called them pizzini. Translated, it just means little slips of paper. But inside those slips was a code so patient, so deliberately boring, that it fooled Italy's best investigators for years because it didn't look like a code at all. It looked like a grocery list. It looked like a Bible verse. It looked like nothing worth reading twice. This is the story of the man who understood something almost no other boss in mafia history ever grasped. The most dangerous message is the one that looks like it isn't a message at all. His name was Bernardo Provenzano, though for most of his career, almost no one in Sicily dared say it above a whisper. Investigators called him the Ghost. His own men called him Trattori, the Tractor, because of the way he flattened every obstacle in his path, slowly, methodically, without ever seeming to hurry. He mattered because he represented a turning point in the history of the Sicilian Mafia, known formally as Cosa Nostra. The generation of bosses before him ruled through spectacle, car bombs, public assassinations, headlines. Provenzano ruled through the opposite instinct. He believed silence was a weapon sharper than any gun, and he built an entire communication system around that belief. That system is why his story matters to anyone trying to understand how organized crime survives modern surveillance. Long before encrypted apps and burner phones, Provenzano had already solved the fundamental problem every criminal organization faces. How do you give orders to hundreds of people without ever leaving evidence that could put you in prison? His answer changed the way Cosa Nostra operated for a generation, and his capture, when it finally came, changed how law enforcement thinks about hiding in plain sight. Bernardo Provenzano was born in January 1933 in Corleone, a small agricultural town in the Sicilian interior that would later become internationally synonymous with the mafia itself, thanks to fiction. But long before Hollywood borrowed its name, Corleone was already producing some of the most powerful and most violent men in Cosa Nostra's real history. He came from a family of modest farmers, the kind of upbringing common to almost every boss of his generation. Formal education was thin. What Corleone offered instead was an apprenticeship in a different kind of literacy, reading the social order of rural Sicily, understanding who owed favors to whom, and learning early that survival in that world depended on discretion. As a young man, Provenzano fell in with a rising local figure named Luciano Liggio, and through him, into the orbit of a wider circle of Corleonesi, men from Corleone who would go on to seize control of the entire Sicilian Mafia in the decades that followed. This wasn't an unusual path. In towns like Corleone, entry into organized crime often looked less like a dramatic recruitment and more like a slow, almost domestic drift, helping with a task here, running an errand there, until the young man found he was already inside. What set Provenzano apart even at this early stage, according to those who later testified against him, wasn't ambition in the flashy sense. It was patience. Where his peers wanted to be seen as tough, Provenzano appeared content to be underestimated. Sicily in the years after the Second World War was a place where the state's authority often felt distant and unreliable, and where local power brokers filled the gaps left by weak institutions. For a young man with few options and fewer resources, aligning with a rising figure like Liggio wasn't necessarily framed as a criminal choice at all. It was simply how influence and protection worked in towns like Corleone. That context doesn't excuse what followed, but it helps explain how ordinary the beginning of an extraordinary criminal career can look from the inside. By his early 20s, Provenzano had reportedly become involved in a string of violent disputes tied to land and local rivalries, the kind of low-level conflicts that, in Corleone at the time, often escalated quickly and were rarely fully investigated. Some historians trace his first serious involvement with Liggio's circle to this period, though the precise details, like much of the earliest chapter of his life, remain difficult to verify with certainty, pieced together decades later from court testimony and the recollections of former associates rather than contemporary records. What is clear is that whatever reputation he built in these early years was built quietly. He wasn't the young man other bosses pointed to as the next star. He was the one who stayed in the background, ran errands without complaint, and remembered every detail he was told, a trait that, in an organization built on trust and discretion, would eventually make him indispensable. By the 1960s, Provenzano had become one of the most trusted enforcers under Luciano Liggio, and later under Salvatore Toto Riina, the man who would come to dominate Cosa Nostra through the 1970s and 80s. Riina and Provenzano formed one of the most consequential partnerships in mafia history, Riina supplying the ruthlessness that made headlines, Provenzano supplying the discipline that kept the machine running underneath. Their alliance helped the Corleonesi faction wage what came to be called the Second Mafia War, a brutal internal conflict in which the Corleonesi violently eliminated rival factions across Sicily to seize control of the mafia's ruling commission. Provenzano's exact role in specific killings from this period remains disputed by historians and was the subject of extensive, sometimes contradictory testimony in Italian courts, a reminder that even well-documented criminal histories carry uncertainty at the edges. What is well established is that Provenzano's reputation grew not from public bravado but from reliability. He managed extortion networks, oversaw construction industry kickbacks, and helped move Cosa Nostra deeper into legitimate-looking businesses, a strategy that would define the organization's approach to money for decades. He was building something less visible than territory, infrastructure, systems for moving money, moving information, and moving blame away from the people at the top. It was during this period that Provenzano first began developing the habits that would later make him legendary. An obsessive caution about being overheard, a preference for face-to-face intermediaries over any form of electronic communication, and an early, instinctive understanding that, in an era of wiretaps, the boss who says the least survives the longest. He also began cultivating something less tangible but arguably more valuable, a reputation for keeping his word. In an organization defined by shifting alliances and sudden betrayals, associates who worked with Provenzano during this period later described him, in court testimony, as someone whose agreements could be relied upon, a rare currency inside Cosa Nostra, where broken promises often ended in bloodshed. That reliability, more than any single violent act, is what investigators believe carried him steadily upward through the organization's ranks over the following 2 decades, even as the Corleonesi faction around him grew more powerful, more feared, and increasingly targeted by the Italian state. By the 1980s, as Riina consolidated near-total control over Cosa Nostra's ruling commission and waged an increasingly open war against judges, police, and rival factions, Provenzano occupied an unusual position, close enough to the top to be fully trusted with the organization's most sensitive logistics, yet distant enough from the public violence that his name, rarely appeared in the newspaper headlines that followed each new killing. That gap between his real influence and his public profile would come to define the rest of his career. By the early 1990s, Cosa Nostra's leadership had been shattered by arrests and a wave of high-profile prosecutions, including the landmark Maxi trial that convicted hundreds of members. Toto Riina himself was captured in 1993. In the vacuum that followed, Bernardo Provenzano rose to become the effective head of the entire Sicilian Mafia, a position he would hold in practice for more than a decade, almost entirely from hiding. This was the paradox at the center of his power. He commanded an organization with tendrils in construction, public contracts, extortion rackets, and political corruption stretching across Sicily and beyond. And yet he lived, for years at a stretch, in a single small farmhouse near Corleone, wearing simple clothes, tending to minor health issues that required him to quietly seek medical treatment under a false identity. His wealth was never displayed the way earlier bosses had flaunted theirs. There were no mansions photographed by police helicopters, no rows of luxury cars. Provenzano's version of power looked almost monastic, a strategic choice, investigators later argued, meant to deny law enforcement the kind of visible extravagance that had helped bring down his predecessors. His real currency was influence. Local businesses paid protection money that flowed upward through trusted intermediaries. Public construction contracts were quietly steered toward mafia-linked firms, and running through all of it was his pizzini system, the handwritten and typewritten notes, some just a few lines long, that served as the nervous system of an organization whose boss refused to ever be recorded saying a single incriminating word. He had rivals, of course, factions within Cosa Nostra, who resented his caution and his diplomatic style of leadership, which favored negotiation and low-profile business over the terrorism-style attacks Riina had once ordered against the Italian state. But for more than a decade, Provenzano's model won out, precisely because it drew so little attention. His relationships during this period were almost entirely mediated through cousins, trusted couriers, and a small circle of intermediaries who had earned his confidence over years, sometimes decades. Few of them ever met him more than a handful of times in person. Instructions moved through this network in the form of the pizzini, each note typically addressing a single, narrow piece of business. Approve this payment, resolve this dispute, welcome this new associate, decline this request. Recipients were expected to destroy the notes after reading them, though the habit was inconsistent enough that investigators would later recover dozens of surviving examples. This diplomatic, almost bureaucratic style of leadership extended even to how Provenzano handled internal disputes. Rather than ordering immediate violence against rivals or subordinates who challenged him, associates described a pattern of patient negotiation, delayed responses, and calculated ambiguity, leaving potential enemies unsure whether they were still in his good graces, which often proved more effective at maintaining control than an outright threat. It was a style of power that left almost no trace for prosecutors to seize on, which is precisely what made it so effective, and precisely what would make dismantling it so difficult. Every empire built on silence has one vulnerability. The silence has to travel through people, and people can be followed, arrested, or turned. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, Italian investigators, most notably prosecutors in Palermo who had spent careers studying Cosa Nostra's internal structure, began quietly building a new kind of case against Provenzano. Traditional wiretaps had failed for years because Provenzano essentially never used a phone the way ordinary criminals did. So investigators shifted their focus to the pizzini themselves. Couriers were tracked, farmhouses were searched, and gradually, agents recovered fragments of Provenzano's notes, some hidden in cracks in walls, others tucked inside religious texts. What they found stunned even veteran investigators. Many of the notes used a simple substitution code rooted in the Bible, assigning numbers to letters based on scripture, so that an innocuous string of digits could conceal names, instructions, or warnings. Other messages relied on nothing more sophisticated than deliberately vague language, phrases about friends, the usual business, or family matters that meant something entirely different to the intended recipient. It wasn't cryptographic brilliance in the mathematical sense. It was something arguably harder to crack, a code built on plainness, a message that looked exactly like the kind of dull, sentimental note an aging relative might write, precisely so that anyone intercepting it would have no reason to look twice. Piecing together this system took investigators years, cross-referencing hundreds of recovered pizzini, corroborating them with the testimony of informants who had once served as couriers. Slowly, a map of Provenzano's entire command structure began to emerge, built not from recordings of his voice, but from the patient accumulation of paper he had assumed no one would ever collect and read side by side. Prosecutors in Palermo, some of whom had spent the better part of their careers pursuing the Corleonesi leadership, treated the recovered notes less like scattered clues and more like a single long document, written one fragment at a time over years. Cross-referencing handwriting, paper stock, and courier movements let investigators build timelines connecting individual pizzini to specific business disputes, extortion payments, and internal disagreements within the organization, the kind of granular detail that would previously have required a wiretap to obtain. The irony was not lost on the investigators themselves. A boss who had built his entire strategy around avoiding the kind of evidence that phone taps produced had instead left behind something arguably more damning, a written record, in his own words, spanning years of decisions. Silence, it turned out, was not the same thing as leaving no trace. On April 11, 2006, after more than 4 decades as a fugitive, Bernardo Provenzano was captured in a farmhouse near Corleone, not through a dramatic raid on a fortified hideout, but through the same patient, unglamorous police work that had finally decoded his messages. Investigators traced a delivery of fresh laundry and supplies to the farmhouse, confirming it as his hiding place before moving in. Inside, they found him living modestly, along with a fresh supply of pizzini and religious texts he used for his coding system. The arrest made international headlines. One of the most wanted fugitives in the world had been living, for years, an ordinary-looking rural life within a short drive of the town where he was born. His trial proceeded largely in absentia for parts of the process, consistent with how many major mafia prosecutions unfolded in Italy during that era, and he was ultimately convicted on multiple counts tied to his role as a mafia boss, including responsibility for orders carried out during the height of Cosa Nostra's war against the Italian state. He received life sentences. Provenzano spent his remaining years in prison, his health declining. He died in July 2016 while still incarcerated, having spent roughly as many years as a fugitive as he had as a free man before going underground, a statistic historians of Cosa Nostra still point to as almost without precedent. With his death, an era of the Sicilian Mafia's history closed. The generation of bosses who had built their power on either open violence or invisible discipline was effectively gone, replaced by a fragmented, lower-profile Cosa Nostra still adapting to a landscape reshaped by decades of prosecutions. The manner of his capture also reshaped how Italian and international law enforcement approached organized crime investigations going forward. Rather than treating fugitive hunts as primarily a matter of physical searches and informant networks, agencies increasingly recognized the value of painstaking document analysis, the same kind of patient cross-referencing that had finally connected Provenzano's scattered notes into a coherent picture of his movements and command structure. In the years since, that lesson has been cited repeatedly in academic and law enforcement literature on organized crime as a case study in how low-technology criminal communication can be defeated not through more advanced technology, but through equally low-technology, methodical investigative work. Bernardo Provenzano's story isn't remembered for spectacle. There was no shootout, no dramatic manhunt across countries, no final confrontation. And that, historians argue, is exactly the point. His true legacy is a lesson about communication itself, about how the most effective way to hide a message isn't to make it unreadable, but to make it unremarkable. Long before digital encryption became a household term, an aging Sicilian farmer with a manual typewriter had already demonstrated that the plainest words can carry the deepest secrets, if the reader has no reason to suspect there's a code there at all. For law enforcement, the Pizzini case became a case study in patience, a reminder that dismantling a criminal organization built on silence sometimes requires an investigation just as quiet, just as slow, and just as willing to read the same ordinary-looking note 100 times until it finally gives something up. For Cosa Nostra, Provenzano's decade of quiet leadership marked a deliberate turn away from the open warfare of the Riina years, toward a lower-profile model of organized crime that prioritized survival over headlines. An approach that, in various forms, continues to shape how the Mafia and other criminal networks operate today. Bernardo Provenzano wanted, above almost everything else, to never be heard. In the end, it was his own handwriting that spoke for him, thousands of small, folded pieces of paper, quietly waiting in evidence rooms across Sicily, still saying more about how power really moves than any wiretap ever could.